The evening air hung thick over Denver that autumn, carrying with it the promise of rain that never seemed to fall. Street lamps flickered to life along Chambers Street as workers poured from office buildings, their faces illuminated briefly by headlights before disappearing into the gathering dusk. Among them was Elaine Merrick, 26 years old, her canvas bag slung across her shoulder, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had begun to loosen during her long shift at the administrative offices of a regional insurance company. She walked with purpose but without hurry, her mind already turning toward home, toward the small apartment she shared with her sister on the eastern edge of the city, toward the leftovers waiting in the refrigerator and the comfort of removing her shoes after 9 hours on her feet. Elaine had never been one to draw attention. She moved through the world with a quiet competence that people often mistook for shyness, though those who knew her understood it was simply efficiency. She spoke when she had something worth saying. She smiled when she meant it. Her co-workers at Hartwell Insurance described her as reliable, pleasant, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and always made a fresh pot of coffee when the break room ran dry. Her sister Maureen would have added that Elaine was stubborn when it mattered, loyal to a fault, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that caught people off guard. On the evening of October 14th, 2002, Elaine left work at her usual time, 6:15 in the evening, after staying late to finish processing a backlog of claims that had accumulated over the weekend. Her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Gloria Fenwick, would later recall that Elaine seemed in good spirits, mentioning plans to watch a television program with her sister that night. The security footage from the building's lobby showed Elaine pushing through the glass doors at 6:17, pausing briefly to adjust her bag, then walking north toward the intersection where Chambers Street met Oakdale Avenue. This was not her typical route home. Usually, Elaine took the bus from a stop 2 blocks south, a journey that required one transfer but delivered her within 3 blocks of her apartment building. On this particular evening, however, the bus had already departed, its taillights visible in the distance as she reached the corner. Rather than wait 25 minutes for the next scheduled arrival, Elaine made a decision that would alter the trajectory of dozens of lives. She stepped to the curb and raised her hand, flagging down a taxi that had been idling near the intersection. The taxi was a faded yellow sedan with a dented rear bumper and a license number that would later be traced to an independent operator named Vincent Halloway. Vincent was 41 at the time, a man whose life had followed a winding path through various occupations and cities before settling into the precarious work of driving a cab through Denver's streets. He'd moved to the city 3 years prior from a smaller town in the western part of the state, seeking what he described to acquaintances as a fresh start, though he rarely elaborated on what exactly he was starting fresh from. Those who encountered him in passing found him unremarkable, a man of average height with thinning brown hair and a tendency to wear flannel shirts regardless of the season. He spoke little, kept his cab reasonably clean, and had accumulated no serious complaints from passengers during his time on the road. According to the account Vincent would provide to police in the initial investigation, Elaine entered his taxi at approximately 6:20 that evening. She gave him an address on Meridian Way, a residential street in the eastern district of Denver, and settled into the back seat. He remembered her as polite but quiet, not interested in conversation, which suited him fine. The drive should have taken no more than 20 minutes given the traffic conditions that evening. The route was straightforward, involving a series of well-lit arterial roads before turning into the quieter residential neighborhoods near her destination. But Elaine never arrived home. When Maureen Merrick returned to their apartment at 8:30 that evening after her own shift at a nearby grocery store, she found the lights off and no sign of her sister. This was unusual, but not immediately alarming. Elaine occasionally stopped for groceries or ran errands after work. Maureen made herself dinner, turned on the television program they had planned to watch together, and waited. By 9:30, she tried calling Elaine's cell phone, but it went directly to voicemail. At 10, She called Gloria Fenwick, who confirmed that Elaine had left the office hours ago. At 11, Maureen contacted the police. The initial response was measured, as it often is in cases of adults who have been out of contact for only a few hours. The dispatcher took down the information, noted that Elaine was an adult with no history of mental illness or suicidal ideation, and suggested that Maureen wait until morning. But Maureen knew her sister with the certainty that comes from sharing not just an apartment, but a lifetime of routines and confidences. Elaine did not disappear. She did not forget to call. She did not stay out late without explanation. Something was wrong. By dawn, when Elaine still had not returned and her phone remained off, the police opened a missing persons case. The investigation began with the standard protocols, retracing her last known movements, interviewing co-workers, checking her bank accounts and phone records. The security footage from her office building provided the image of her leaving, healthy and unharmed. Witnesses near the intersection of Chambers and Oakdale confirmed seeing a young woman matching her description entering a taxi around 6:20. One witness, an elderly man walking his dog, even remembered part of the license plate number, enough to eventually identify Vincent Holloway as the driver. When detectives arrived at Vincent's address 2 days after Elaine's disappearance, they found him cooperative but vague. Yes, he remembered picking up a woman matching that description. Yes, he had driven her toward the Eastern District. But he claimed to have dropped her off safely at the address she requested, watching her walk toward an apartment building before driving away to pick up his next fare. He seemed puzzled by the questions, concerned even, asking if the woman was all right. His taxi was examined, searched thoroughly for any evidence of foul play. They found nothing remarkable. No blood, no signs of struggle, no personal effects that could be conclusively linked to Elaine. The interior smelled of the cheap air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror and the faint mustiness of old upholstery. Vincent's background check revealed a history that was unremarkable in its ordinariness. He had no criminal record beyond a few traffic violations. He had worked various jobs, restaurant cook, warehouse loader, security guard at a shopping center before obtaining his taxi license. Former employers described him as quiet, punctual, someone who kept to himself. He had never married, had no children, lived alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of the city. Neighbors barely knew him, reporting only that he kept irregular hours and maintained his property adequately. There was nothing in his history that suggested violence or predatory behavior. The investigation expanded outward. Police canvassed the neighborhood around Meridian Way, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Elaine that evening. No one had. They searched the route between her office and her apartment, looking for any sign that she might have exited the taxi early, might have encountered trouble on foot. They found nothing. Her phone records showed no calls or texts after she left work. Her bank account showed no activity. Her credit cards remained unused. It was as though she had simply evaporated into the October evening, leaving behind only the faint outline of her passage through the world. Maureen became the public face of the search, appearing on local news broadcasts, distributing flyers with Elaine's photograph, organizing volunteer search parties that combed through parks and vacant lots. She spoke with a controlled desperation that resonated with viewers, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. She described her sister's laugh, her habits, the small details that made Elaine a person rather than a statistic. The community responded with sympathy and offers of help, but weeks passed without any substantive leads. Vincent Holloway was questioned multiple times during those early weeks. Each time his story remained consistent. He had picked up Elaine at the intersection. He had driven her to Meridian Way. He had watched her exit the taxi and walk toward the building. He had driven away. His calm demeanor frustrated investigators who suspected he knew more than he was revealing, but suspicion without evidence leads nowhere. Lie detector tests, which Vincent agreed to take, came back inconclusive. neither clearly indicating deception nor confirming truthfulness. Without physical evidence, without witnesses to contradict his account, without even a body to prove that a crime had occurred, the case stalled. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation began to cool along with the weather. The volunteer searches became less frequent as hope faded. The news coverage diminished, replaced by fresher tragedies and more immediate concerns. Maureen continued her efforts with a grim determination, but even she could feel the case slipping into the realm of cold files and unsolved mysteries. Elaine's apartment remained as she had left it, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her coffee mug still sitting in the dish rack, waiting for her return. Maureen could not bring herself to pack these things away. To do so would be an admission she was not yet prepared to make. The lead detective on the case, a weathered veteran named Carl Brennan, refused to let it go entirely. He had worked dozens of missing persons cases over his career, and something about this one gnawed at him. The completeness of Elaine's disappearance troubled him. People did not simply vanish. There were always traces, always threads to pull. But in this case, the threads led nowhere, terminating at the door of Vincent Halloway's taxi and then simply ending as though Elaine had stepped into a void. Carl kept the case file on his desk, reviewing it during quiet moments, looking for the detail he might have missed, the question he had failed to ask. Vincent Halloway continued driving his taxi through the streets of Denver, maintaining his quiet routine, his unremarkable existence. If he felt the weight of suspicion, he did not show it. If he harbored secrets, they remained locked behind the bland facade of his everyday life. To the few passengers who engaged him in conversation, he was polite but distant. A man simply doing his job, counting the hours until he could return to his small house and his solitary life. The city moved on, as cities do. New crimes demanded attention, new tragedies unfolded. Elaine Merrick became another name on a long list of people who had disappeared into the cracks of urban life, remembered by those who loved her, but gradually fading from public consciousness. The missing persons posters that had once blanketed telephone poles and shop windows grew weathered and torn, eventually disappearing entirely. Only Maureen kept vigil, maintaining a website dedicated to her sister's case, updating it with appeals for information that went largely unanswered. Years accumulated like dust. 2003 became 2004, then 5, then 6. The world changed around the static mystery of Elaine's disappearance. Carl Brennan retired from the police force, handing over his active cases but keeping a copy of Elaine's file for his personal records. Vincent Halloway eventually gave up driving a taxi, taking a job as a night watchman at a storage facility on the southern edge of the city. Maureen moved to a different apartment, unable to continue living in the space she had shared with her sister. But she never stopped searching, never stopped hoping for answers. By 2012, a full decade had passed since that October evening. Elaine would have been 36 years old. Maureen had married, had a daughter of her own, built a life that existed in the shadow of her sister's absence. The case remained officially open but practically dormant, one of hundreds of unsolved disappearances in files across the state. The likelihood of resolution had diminished to near impossibility. Cold cases occasionally broke open due to new technology or unexpected confessions, but more often they simply remained cold, mysteries preserved in amber, forever unresolved. And then, on a grey morning in March of that year, Vincent Halloway walked into a police station in the northern suburbs of Denver and asked to speak with a detective about a matter that had been troubling his conscience for a very long time. The detective who met with Vincent Halloway that morning was a woman named Sarah Chen, 32 years old, relatively new to the department's cold case unit, but already earning a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. She had reviewed the Elaine Merrick file during her orientation, one of dozens of unsolved cases now under her purview, and she remembered being struck by the completeness of the woman's vanishing. When the desk sergeant informed her that a man was asking to discuss an old missing persons case, she felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied potential breakthroughs, tempered by the professional skepticism that came from encountering too many false confessions and attention seekers. Vincent sat in the interview room with his hands folded on the metal table, his posture suggesting neither anxiety nor defiance, but rather a peculiar kind of resignation. He had aged in the decade since Elaine's disappearance, his hair now more grey than brown, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He wore a maintenance worker's uniform with his name embroidered on the chest pocket, and he smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution. When Sarah entered with her partner, a veteran detective named Marcus Wade, Vincent looked up with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between relief and dread. Sarah began with the standard preliminaries, establishing his identity, confirming that he was there voluntarily, reading him his rights even though he was not under arrest. Vincent listened patiently to each formality, then interrupted with a quiet statement that would reshape the entire investigation. He said he needed to tell them about the night he picked up a woman named Elaine Merrick, about what really happened after she entered his taxi, about where he had left her and why he had lied for 10 years. The recording of that interview would later be transcribed and analyzed countless times, but the essential facts emerged clearly in that first conversation. Vincent explained that on the evening of October 14th, 2002, he had indeed picked up Elaine at the intersection of Chambers and Oakdale. He had begun driving toward the address she provided on Meridian Way. But approximately halfway through the journey, while stopped at a traffic light on Ashford Boulevard, Elaine had suddenly asked him to change the destination. She had seemed agitated, repeatedly checking her phone, looking through the rear window as though concerned about being followed. She asked him to take her instead to a different address, a location in the warehouse district south of downtown, an area that was largely abandoned in the evening hours. Vincent claimed he had questioned whether she was certain, noting that the neighborhood was not particularly safe after dark. Elaine had insisted, offering to pay extra for the change in route. He had complied, turning south toward the industrial area, navigating through streets that grew progressively darker and more isolated. When they reached the address she specified, a deserted street lined with loading docks and shuttered businesses, Elaine had paid the fare, added a generous tip, and exited the taxi quickly, walking toward a warehouse entrance with her phone pressed to her ear. This was the last time Vincent claimed to have seen her. He said he had waited for a moment, uncertain whether he should leave a young woman alone in such a desolate area. But Elaine had waved him away with an impatient gesture, disappearing around the corner of a building. He had driven off, troubled by the situation, but unsure what else to do. In the days that followed, when news of her disappearance began circulating, he had made a decision that he now characterized as cowardly and foolish. He had convinced himself that telling the truth would make him a suspect, that admitting he had dropped her in the warehouse district rather than at the residential address she had originally requested would seem suspicious. So he had lied, sticking to the story that he had taken her to Meridian Way and watched her walk safely toward an apartment building. For 10 years he had carried this lie, watching as the investigation foundered partly because of the misdirection he had provided. He claimed that guilt had accumulated gradually like sediment until he could no longer sustain the weight of it. He said he understood that coming forward now might result in criminal charges for obstruction of justice, but he could not continue living with the knowledge that his deception might have prevented Elaine's family from finding answers. Sarah and Marcus listened to this account with expressions of carefully controlled reaction. The story was simultaneously plausible and convenient, explaining Vincent's earlier inconsistencies while also potentially shifting investigative focus away from him and toward the mysterious circumstances of Elaine's change in destination. The critical question was whether any part of it could be verified after a decade had passed. The warehouse district Vincent described had changed significantly in the intervening years. What had been a declining industrial area in 2002 had undergone substantial redevelopment, with several warehouses converted into loft apartments and art studios, new businesses opening, entire blocks transformed by urban renewal initiatives. The specific address Vincent provided was now a microbrewery with exposed brick walls and industrial chic lighting. Whatever had existed there 10 years ago had been demolished or renovated beyond recognition. Sarah immediately began the painstaking process of verification. She pulled traffic camera footage from the night in question, though much of it had been archived or discarded over the years. She contacted the city's transportation department, requesting route records and toll data. She interviewed warehouse workers and security personnel who had been employed in the district during that period, asking if anyone remembered seeing a taxi or a young woman matching Elaine's description. Most of the leads evaporated upon contact. Businesses had closed, employees had moved on, memories had faded or proven unreliable. The news of Vincent's confession, carefully controlled at first, eventually reached Maureen through a phone call from Sarah Chen. Maureen had been at work, managing accounts for a non-profit organization, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. Sarah's careful, professional voice delivered information that Maureen had both longed for and dreaded for a decade. There was a potential break in her sister's case. New information had emerged. The investigation was being reopened. Maureen's first reaction was not relief or excitement, but rather a profound exhaustion, as though some internal mechanism that had been holding her upright for 10 years had suddenly released. She asked Sarah to repeat everything, taking notes with shaking hands, her co-workers glancing over with concern as her face drained of color. When the call ended, Maureen sat motionless at her desk, staring at the words she had written. Warehouse district. Change destination. Vincent Halloway. After so many years of silence, these fragments of information felt both substantial and impossibly inadequate. The reopening of the case generated renewed media attention, though of a more subdued nature than the initial investigation. 10 years was a long time in the news cycle, and many of the reporters who had covered Elaine's disappearance had moved to other cities or different careers. But the story still held elements that attracted coverage. The decade-long deception, the mysterious change in destination, the possibility of answers after years of uncertainty. Maureen once again found herself in front of cameras, older now, her face marked by the years of waiting, speaking about her sister with a voice that carried the weight of sustained grief. Carl Brennan, the original lead detective, heard about the development through his network of former colleagues. He was 68 now, retired for 6 years, spending his days maintaining a small garden and volunteering at a community center. But the Elaine Merrick case had never truly left him. When he learned that Vincent Halloway had come forward with a new account, Carl felt a complicated mixture of vindication and frustration. He had always suspected that Vincent knew more than he was revealing, but suspicion without evidence had been worthless. Now, a decade later, the truth was emerging, if it was indeed the truth. Carl reached out to Sarah Chen, offering his assistance in whatever capacity might be useful. Sarah, who respected the institutional knowledge that retired detectives carried, welcomed his input. They met at a coffee shop near the police station, and Carl spread out his personal copies of the case file, pages now yellowed and coffee-stained, margins filled with handwritten notes from years of periodic review. He walked Sarah through his original investigation, the interviews he had conducted, the theories he had developed and discarded, the nagging sense that the answer had always been just beyond reach. The two detectives, separated by a generation but united by commitment to solving the case, began constructing a new investigation around Vincent's revised account. They focused on the warehouse district as it had existed in 2002, pulling building permits, business licenses, security company records, anything that might provide insight into who had been operating in that area during the relevant time frame. They discovered that several warehouses had been used as informal storage by various businesses, some legitimate and some operating in legal grey areas. There had been complaints about illegal dumping, reports of squatters, occasional drug activity, but nothing that immediately suggested a connection to Elaine's disappearance. One promising lead emerged from property records. The specific address Vincent had identified had been owned by a company called Meridian Holdings, a name that Sarah noted matched the street where Elaine had originally asked to be taken. Further investigation revealed that Meridian Holdings was a shell corporation that had dissolved in 2004, its assets liquidated, its principals difficult to trace. The warehouse itself had been sold to developers in 2006 and subsequently demolished to make way for new construction. Sarah obtained a warrant to excavate the site, a process complicated by the fact that it was now occupied by a thriving business. The brewery's owners were cooperative but understandably concerned about the disruption to their operations. A team of forensic specialists arrived with ground-penetrating radar, scanning the area for anomalies that might indicate disturbed earth or buried remains. The process took 3 days, with Sarah and Marcus present throughout, watching technicians mark grid patterns and analyze data readings. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the radar detected a significant anomaly beneath the brewery's outdoor patio area, under several feet of concrete and gravel that had been laid during the building's renovation. The signature suggested something organic, something that did not match the surrounding soil composition. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as she authorized excavation of the site. Heavy equipment was brought in to carefully remove the concrete, then hand tools were used to probe the layers beneath. What they found, approximately 6 feet below the current ground level, were human remains. The preservation was poor after a decade of burial, but enough remained for forensic analysis. A woman's clothing, degraded but still partially intact. Personal effects including a canvas bag with corroded metal hardware, and most significantly, a cell phone, its battery long dead but its memory potentially recoverable with the right technology. The medical examiner who conducted the initial assessment could not immediately confirm identity, but the physical characteristics were consistent with Elaine Merrick. Female, approximate age mid-20s at time of death, height and build matching known parameters. Dental records would be needed for definitive identification, a process that would take several days. But Sarah already knew, with the intuition that experienced investigators develop, that they had found Elaine. Maureen received the news in a phone call that began with Sarah's carefully modulated voice saying there had been a significant development in the case. Maureen had been expecting this call since the excavation began, monitoring news reports, unable to sleep or eat or focus on anything else. When Sarah explained that remains had been recovered and preliminary indicators suggested they were likely Elaine's, Maureen experienced a strange sense of dual realities. One part of her mind registered the information clinically, noting the details, asking appropriate questions about next steps and timelines. Another part seemed to separate entirely, floating somewhere above the conversation, observing her own reactions with detached curiosity. She called her husband, then drove to her mother's house, needing to deliver the news in person. Her mother, now 74 and living in an assisted care facility since suffering a stroke 3 years earlier, had never stopped asking about Elaine, her memory of recent events unreliable, but her memory of her missing daughter perfectly preserved. Maureen sat beside her mother's bed and held her hand and explained that Elaine had been found, that there would be answers now, that at least they could bring her home. The forensic analysis proceeded with meticulous care. The dental records confirmed what everyone already believed. The remains were those of Elaine Merrick. The clothing and personal effects were catalogued, photographed, analyzed for trace evidence. The cell phone was transported to a specialized laboratory where technicians worked to extract any recoverable data from its degraded memory. The soil surrounding the burial site was screened for evidence, though the construction and renovation of the location had disturbed much of the original context. The cause of death proved difficult to establish with certainty. The remains showed no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no fractures or cut marks that would indicate violent injury. The soft tissue had decomposed beyond the point where more subtle causes could be determined. The medical examiner's report concluded that the manner of death could not be definitively established, but was consistent with either homicide or accident. This ambiguity would prove legally significant in the weeks to come. Vincent Holloway was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, false statements to police, and improper disposal of human remains. But prosecutors faced a significant challenge in pursuing more serious charges. Vincent's account, whatever its flaws and convenient omissions, could not be definitively contradicted by the physical evidence. He maintained that he had simply dropped Elaine at the location she requested, that he had no knowledge of what happened to her afterward, that his only crime was lying about where he had taken her. Without evidence of his direct involvement in her death, without witnesses or forensic proof connecting him to the burial, the case for murder remained circumstantial at best. Sarah and Marcus continued investigating, pursuing every possible angle. They re-interviewed everyone connected to the original case, looking for details that might have been missed or connections that had not been apparent a decade earlier. They examined Elaine's phone records again, focusing on the period immediately before her disappearance, looking for evidence of who she might have been meeting in the warehouse district. They investigated Meridian Holdings exhaustively, tracing its corporate structure through layers of paperwork, identifying individuals who had been associated with the company. One name that emerged from this analysis was a man named Robert Payne, who had been listed as Meridian Holdings' registered agent. Robert had a history that included fraud charges, business disputes, and allegations of involvement in various questionable enterprises. By 2012, he was serving time in a federal prison for an unrelated financial crime. Sarah and Marcus traveled to the facility to interview him, hoping he might provide information about what Meridian Holdings had been using the warehouse for and who might have had access to the property in October of 2002. Robert proved to be a practiced liar, someone who had spent years evading accountability through misdirection and selective disclosure. He claimed to have minimal knowledge of day-to-day operations at the warehouse, characterizing his role as purely administrative. But when pressed about the specific time frame of Elaine's disappearance, something shifted in his demeanor. He asked if cooperation might influence his current sentence. Sarah made no promises, but indicated that helpful information would be noted. Robert then provided names of individuals who had been using the warehouse as a storage facility for various enterprises, some legitimate and some decidedly not. The investigation expanded once more, following these new threads into a complicated network of business relationships and criminal associations. Several of the individuals Robert named had died in the intervening years. Others had scattered across the country, pursuing new schemes or serving time for various offenses. But patient detective work eventually constructed a picture of the warehouse's use in 2002. It had been a hub for various illegal activities, including the storage of stolen property, the distribution of counterfeit goods, and occasional use as a meeting place for business dealings that required privacy. The theory that began to emerge was that Elaine had not been randomly targeted by Vincent Holloway, but rather had become entangled in something connected to the warehouse location. Perhaps she had witnessed something she should not have seen, or perhaps her presence there that evening had been arranged for reasons that remained unclear. The change in destination that Vincent described, the agitated behavior, the phone call, all suggested that Elaine had been involved in some situation that she either sought out or was coerced into. Sarah obtained authorization to examine Elaine's recovered phone using advanced forensic techniques that had not existed at the time of her disappearance. The process was painstaking, involving the careful extraction of the phone's memory chip and the use of specialized equipment to read degraded data. Much of the information was corrupted beyond recovery, but fragments emerged. Partial text messages, pieces of call logs, fragments of deleted data that suggested communications with numbers that were no longer in service. One recovered text message, dated the day before Elaine's disappearance, was particularly significant. Though partially corrupted, the readable portions included the warehouse address and a reference to meeting someone to discuss something important. The sender's number had been registered to a prepaid phone purchased with cash, untraceable through conventional means. But the existence of the message supported the theory that Elaine's trip to the warehouse had been prearranged, that she had gone there intentionally to meet someone. Maureen struggled to reconcile this new information with her understanding of her sister. Elaine had never mentioned any problems, any dangerous entanglements, any reason to meet unknown contacts in abandoned warehouses. But Sarah gently reminded her that siblings, no matter how close, do not share every aspect of their lives. Perhaps Elaine had been involved in something she kept private, something she thought she could handle on her own. Perhaps she had been helping someone or investigating something that turned dangerous without warning. The passage of months brought additional developments, but no definitive answers. The district attorney's office debated whether sufficient evidence existed to charge anyone beyond Vincent Holloway with crimes related to Elaine's death. The ambiguity surrounding the cause of death, the inability to prove direct involvement by any suspect, the decade that had elapsed allowing evidence to deteriorate and memories to fade, all conspired to make prosecution challenging. Vincent Holloway eventually pleaded guilty to the charges of obstruction and false statements, receiving a sentence of 5 years in prison. It was a resolution that satisfied no one, least of all Maureen, who attended every court hearing and felt the inadequacy of the outcome deep in her bones. Justice, she was learning, was not always proportional to loss. The legal system operated according to standards of proof that sometimes could not accommodate the certainty of the heart. Carl Brennan attended Vincent's sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, observing the man he had interviewed so many times years earlier. When Vincent made a brief statement, expressing remorse for his deception and claiming ignorance of what had truly happened to Elaine, Carl studied his face for signs of deeper guilt. What he saw was a man who had perhaps told enough truth to ease his conscience while withholding whatever additional knowledge might incriminate him further. It was a familiar pattern, one Carl had encountered throughout his career. People seldom told complete truths. They told versions that served their interests, that allowed them to sleep at night, that kept the worst consequences at bay. The burial site yielded one final piece of evidence months after the initial excavation. A forensic botanist examining soil samples identified pollen from a plant species that had a limited growing range, primarily in the foothills west of Denver. The presence of this pollen on Elaine's clothing suggested she had been in that region at some point, before being buried at the warehouse site. This detail opened yet another avenue of investigation, the possibility that Elaine had been taken somewhere else before ending up at the location where her remains were found. Sarah followed this lead with characteristic thoroughness, examining property records and attempting to identify locations in the foothills that might have some connection to the individuals associated with Meridian Holdings. But the task was enormous, covering thousands of acres and countless properties, many of them remote and difficult to access. Without more specific information, the pollen evidence, while intriguing, led nowhere definitive. As the 2-year anniversary of Vincent's confession approached, the active investigation began to wind down once more. Sarah had pursued every lead, exhausted every reasonable avenue of inquiry, and arrived at a frustrating partial truth. They knew where Elaine had ended up. They had a general sense of the circumstances that led to her death. But the specific details, the complete story, remained elusive, protected by the silence of those who knew and the passage of time that had erased so much evidence. Maureen found a measure of peace in finally being able to lay her sister to rest properly. The funeral, held on a bright afternoon in May, was attended by family, friends, former co-workers, and a surprising number of community members who had followed the case over the years. Sarah Chen attended, standing at the back, watching Maureen speak about her sister with a composure that came from years of practiced grief. The words Maureen chose were carefully considered, acknowledging the questions that remained unanswered while also celebrating the life that Elaine had lived, the person she had been beyond the mystery of her death. In the months that followed, Maureen transformed her advocacy. She began working with other families of missing persons, offering the hard-won wisdom of someone who had navigated the worst aspects of such cases. She lobbied for legislative changes that would improve how missing persons investigations were conducted, arguing for better coordination between jurisdictions, more resources for cold case units, mandatory training in investigative best practices. Her daughter, now 10 years old, sometimes accompanied her to these meetings, listening to her mother explain why this work mattered, learning lessons about persistence and justice, and the importance of speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Sarah Chen kept Elaine's case file active, reviewing it periodically, remaining alert for any new information that might emerge. She had learned from Carl Brennan that some cases never fully close, that they remain open questions even after official resolutions, that truth sometimes reveals itself in unexpected ways years after everyone has stopped looking. On a cold morning in November, nearly 3 years after Vincent's confession, Sarah received a call from a detective in a neighboring county regarding an unrelated investigation into financial crimes. While examining records from a defunct company, they had discovered documents that referenced Meridian Holdings and included correspondence about the warehouse property. Among these papers was a handwritten note dated October 2002, mentioning a meeting scheduled for the 14th of that month to discuss a problem that needed to be resolved quietly. The note did not mention Elaine by name, but the date and the language sent a chill through Sarah as she read the scanned copy that had been emailed to her. The detective who had found the documents explained that the company under investigation had been run by an individual named Thomas Kern, who had died in a car accident in 2009. Thomas had been one of the associates Robert Payne had named during his prison interview, but at the time there had been no direct evidence connecting him to Elaine's case. Now, this note suggested he might have been involved in whatever had transpired at the warehouse that night. Sarah reopened her active investigation, pulling together everything known about Thomas Kern, his business relationships, his movements in October of 2002. She discovered that he had owned a cabin property in the foothills, in an area consistent with the pollen evidence found on Elaine's clothing. Though Thomas was beyond prosecution, understanding his potential involvement might finally answer the questions that had haunted the case for over a decade. The cabin had been sold after Thomas's death, changing hands twice since then, but Sarah obtained permission to visit the property with a forensic team. The current owners, a retired couple who used it as a weekend retreat, knew nothing of its previous owners' activities but allowed a thorough search. In a storage shed behind the cabin, buried under years of accumulated junk, investigators found a box of old business records that Thomas's estate had apparently never fully cleared out. Among these papers was a day planner from 2002, The entry for October 14th showed an appointment time and the initials EM, along with the warehouse address. The preceding entries suggested a pattern of meetings related to what Thomas had labelled as investment opportunities, though the vague language suggested something less legitimate. The planner indicated that Elaine had been in contact with Thomas, that she had arranged to meet him, though the purpose remained unclear. Sarah interviewed former co-workers of Elaine's again, this time asking specifically about any mention of investment opportunities or financial dealings. One woman, Gloria Fenwick, Elaine's former supervisor, recalled after much prompting that Elaine had mentioned looking into a potential investment for retirement, something that promised better returns than her standard savings account. Gloria had warned her to be careful, to research thoroughly before committing any money, but she did not know if Elaine had pursued it further. The picture that finally emerged was tragic in its ordinariness. Elaine, responsible and financially cautious, had apparently been contacted by someone offering an investment opportunity. She had arranged to meet to discuss the details, perhaps intending to ask questions or review documents before making any commitment. She had gone to the warehouse that evening, believing she was attending a legitimate business meeting. What had transpired there, why the meeting had resulted in her death, remained speculative without witnesses or detailed evidence. But the most likely scenario, based on what could be reconstructed, was that Elaine had somehow become aware of illegal activity, had reacted with alarm, or threatened to report what she had learned, and had been killed to ensure her silence. The recognition that Elaine's death might have resulted from nothing more than an attempt to protect her savings, to be responsible and plan for her future, carried a particular weight of sorrow. There had been no dramatic conspiracy, no complex criminal plot targeting her specifically. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had encountered dangerous people in the course of what she thought was a routine transaction, and had paid the ultimate price for that encounter. Maureen absorbed this final piece of the puzzle with the exhausted acceptance of someone who had been seeking answers for too long. The truth, when it finally arrived, brought no satisfaction. Only the cold confirmation that her sister's death had been as senseless as she had always feared. There would be no additional prosecutions, no dramatic courtroom revelations, no complete justice. There was only this: knowledge of what had probably happened, understanding of the circumstances that had led to Elaine's death, and the small comfort of knowing that she had been trying to build a better future when that future was taken from her. Sarah Chen closed the active investigation file for the second and final time, her report detailed and thorough, acknowledging both what had been learned and what remained uncertain. She had given the case everything her skills and resources allowed. Sometimes, she reflected, that had to be enough. The story of Elaine Merrick, like so many stories of loss and investigation, did not end with dramatic resolution, but rather with the quiet accumulation of understanding, pieces of truth assembled slowly over years, creating a picture that was incomplete but recognizable. Her grave, in a cemetery on the eastern edge of Denver, became a place where Maureen brought her daughter to remember an aunt she had never met, to tell stories about the woman Elaine had been, to ensure that she remained more than a case file, more than a cautionary tale, more than another name on the long list of those who had vanished and been found too late. Vincent Holloway sat in the visitation room of the correctional facility, his hands resting flat on the table between them, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked directly into Sarah Chen's eyes, without the careful guardedness that had characterized all their previous encounters. The late afternoon light filtered through the reinforced windows, casting long shadows across the scarred surface where countless conversations had taken place between inmates and the outside world. Sarah had not planned this visit, had not included it in any official report or investigation timeline, but something about the emergence of Thomas Kern's day planner had compelled her to make the drive, to sit across from the man whose partial truths had shaped so much of what they knew and did not know about Elaine Merrick's final hours. Vincent's hair had gone completely grey during his incarceration, and he had lost weight, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had never been particularly substantial. He looked older than his 54 years, worn down by whatever burden he carried, whatever truths he still protected, or perhaps genuinely did not possess. Sarah had learned over her years in law enforcement that guilt manifested in infinite varieties, that people held onto secrets for reasons ranging from self-preservation to misguided loyalty, to simple fear of consequences they could not fully articulate. She spread the photocopied page from Thomas Kern's planner on the table between them, the handwritten notation with Elaine's initials clearly visible. Vincent studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then looked back up at Sarah with something that might have been resignation or perhaps relief. He began to speak, his voice quiet but steady, and what emerged was not a dramatic confession, but rather a series of small admissions that filled gaps Sarah had not even known existed. Yes, he had recognized Thomas Kern's name when it had come up in the original investigation, though he had claimed ignorance at the time. Yes, he had known more about what Meridian Holdings was using the warehouse for than he had revealed. No, he had not killed Elaine or directly participated in her death, but he had been present in the area that evening longer than he had admitted, had seen more than he had disclosed. Vincent explained that he had occasionally done side work for people associated with Meridian Holdings, providing transportation for items or individuals that required discretion. It was not work he was proud of, but it paid better than regular taxi fares, and he had convinced himself that he was not responsible for whatever business these people conducted. On the evening of October 14th, he had indeed picked up Elaine at the intersection she flagged him down from, had driven her to the warehouse district as she requested. But what he had not revealed was that he had been scheduled to return to that same area an hour later for one of his irregular assignments, transporting Thomas Kern to a meeting at a different location. When Vincent had returned to the warehouse district that night, driving slowly through the dark streets, looking for the specific loading dock where he was supposed to meet Thomas, he had seen something that had frozen him with fear. The loading dock door was partially open, light spilling out into the darkness, and visible through the gap were figures engaged in what was clearly an argument. Vincent had been too far away to hear words, but the body language spoke of confrontation, of a situation spiraling beyond control. He had recognized Thomas Kern's profile, and he had seen the smaller figure of a woman who he realized with growing dread was the passenger he had dropped off earlier. Vincent claimed he had panicked, unsure what to do, whether to drive away or intervene or call for help. The decision had been made for him when one of the figures had spotted his taxi idling at the corner, had gestured in his direction with what might have been recognition or warning. Vincent had driven away quickly, his heart pounding, certain that he had just witnessed something terrible about to happen, or perhaps already happening, knowing that his association with these people made him complicit in ways he could barely acknowledge. In the days that followed, as news of Elaine's disappearance spread, Vincent had been paralyzed by fear and shame. He convinced himself that coming forward would accomplish nothing except to implicate himself in activities he had only peripherally participated in. He told himself that he did not actually know what had happened after he drove away, that perhaps Elaine had left safely through another exit, that his fears had been unfounded. These rationalizations had allowed him to maintain his lie for a decade, until the weight of it had finally broken through whatever psychological barriers he had constructed. Even now, sitting in the prison visitation room, Vincent insisted he did not know exactly what had happened to Elaine after he drove away that second time. He did not know if Thomas Kern had killed her intentionally, or if her death had been some kind of accident during the confrontation Vincent had witnessed. He did not know who else might have been involved, or why Elaine had been there in the first place. His knowledge ended at the moment he drove away, a coward fleeing from consequences he had helped create through his willingness to look the other way, to profit from associations with dangerous people, to prioritize his own safety over any responsibility to intervene or report. Sarah listened to all of this with the practiced neutrality that came from years of hearing confessions and partial truths. But inside, she felt a familiar anger at the cascade of small moral failures that had allowed a young woman's death to go unsolved for so long. Vincent's confession now, belated and still incomplete, changed nothing about the fundamental facts of the case. Thomas Kern was beyond prosecution. The others, who might have been present that night, remained shadows, identifiable perhaps through Vincent's testimony, but impossible to conclusively connect to Elaine's death without additional evidence. The legal machinery that might have brought fuller justice had been dismantled by time and by Vincent's decade of silence. When Sarah left the correctional facility that evening, driving back toward the city as the sun set behind the mountains, she carried with her the knowledge that this was truly the end of the investigation. There would be no dramatic arrests, no trial that would provide Maureen with the satisfaction of seeing her sister's killer publicly held accountable. There was only this: a clearer understanding of the circumstances, a more complete picture of Elaine's final hours, and the cold comfort of knowing that the partial truths they had assembled represented the closest approximation of justice that the case would ever achieve. She scheduled a meeting with Maureen for the following day, choosing a quiet coffee shop rather than the sterile environment of the police station. When Maureen arrived, punctual as always, Sarah could see in her face the exhaustion of someone who had been bracing for difficult news for so many years that the anticipation had become a permanent condition. They sat in a corner booth, away from other patrons, and Sarah walked Maureen through Vincent's latest revelations with the careful attention to detail that characterized all her work. Maureen listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that gradually cooled untouched. When Sarah finished, Maureen sat in silence for a long time, processing, integrating this new information into the narrative she had been constructing and reconstructing for 13 years. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying neither anger nor relief, but rather a profound weariness. She said she had known on some level that the complete truth would never emerge, that there would always be gaps and uncertainties that no amount of investigation could fill. She said she had made peace with that reality years ago, or thought she had, but that each new revelation reopened wounds she had imagined were healing. She said she was grateful for Sarah's persistence, for Carl Brennan's decades of caring about her sister's case, for all the people who had refused to let Elaine become just another statistic. But she also said she needed to find a way to move forward that did not require waiting for justice that might never fully arrive. In the weeks that followed, Maureen made decisions about how to honor her sister's memory in ways that transcended the investigation and its disappointing partial resolution. She established a scholarship fund in Elaine's name for young women pursuing careers in fields where they had been historically underrepresented, channeling her grief into creating opportunities that Elaine herself would have valued. She continued her advocacy work with families of missing persons, but she also began to step back from the most consuming aspects of that role, recognizing that she needed to preserve space in her life for healing rather than constantly reopening her own trauma in service of others. Her daughter, Emma, now 13 and perceptive beyond her years, had grown up hearing stories about the aunt she had never met, understanding from early childhood that loss and love were intertwined in ways that shaped her mother's worldview. Maureen had been careful to present Elaine as a complete person rather than a victim defined by her death, sharing memories of her humor, her stubbornness, the small kindnesses she had extended to others, the dreams she had held for her future. Emma absorbed these stories and began to incorporate them into her own developing sense of identity, seeing in her mother's perseverance a model for how to respond to injustice, how to insist on remembering those the world might prefer to forget. Sarah Chen continued her work in the cold case unit, carrying forward the lessons she had learned from the Merrick investigation into every subsequent case that crossed her desk. She developed protocols for maintaining contact with victims' families over years and even decades, understanding that closure was not a single moment, but rather an ongoing process that required sustained support. She trained younger detectives in the patience and thoroughness that cases like Elaine's demanded, teaching them to see beyond the immediate evidence to the human stories that shaped every investigation. Carl Brennan, now 71 and dealing with health issues that had begun to limit his mobility, maintained his interest in the case until his final days. When he died quietly in his sleep on a winter morning 2 years after Vincent's final confession, his family found among his possessions a worn folder containing every document related to Elaine Merrick's disappearance and investigation. His daughter contacted Sarah, offering to donate the materials to the police department's archives, and Sarah accepted them with gratitude and a sense of continuity, understanding that Carl's dedication represented a promise kept across decades, a refusal to abandon someone who could no longer advocate for herself. The city continued its evolution, as cities do, with neighborhoods transforming, populations shifting, new crises demanding attention, while old tragedies faded from immediate consciousness. The brewery that occupied the site where Elaine had been found flourished, its owners respectful of the history, but also needing to operate a business in the present. They installed a small plaque near the entrance, tasteful and understated, acknowledging that the site held significance beyond its current commercial purpose, that ground could carry memory even as it served new functions. Vincent Holloway served his sentence quietly, participating in available programs, causing no trouble, existing in the liminal space of someone who had confessed enough to ease his conscience, but perhaps not everything that burdened it. When he was released after 4 years, reduced for good behavior, he returned to a world that had continued without him, finding work in positions that required no trust or responsibility, living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of a different city, carrying with him whatever complete truth he possessed about that October evening 20 years earlier. On the 20th anniversary of Elaine's disappearance, Maureen organized a small memorial gathering at the cemetery where her sister was buried. The turnout was modest, comprising family members, a few former co-workers who remembered Elaine with genuine fondness, Sarah Chen representing the ongoing commitment of law enforcement to remembering victims, and surprisingly, several people Maureen had met through her advocacy work. Individuals who had lost loved ones to violence or disappearance and who understood the specific shape of her grief. Emma, now 16 and possessing her mother's quiet strength, combined with a creative sensibility uniquely her own, had prepared remarks for the gathering. She stood before the small group and spoke about an aunt she knew only through stories, about the ways that absence shapes presence, about how the determination to remember becomes its own form of resistance against the forces that would prefer forgetting. Her words were poetic without being sentimental, honest about pain, while also insisting on hope, and as Maureen listened to her daughter speak, she felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained for 2 decades. After the formal gathering concluded, Maureen stood alone at Elaine's grave, the others having offered condolences and departed, giving her the private space they understood she needed. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground, and Maureen allowed herself to simply exist in the moment without the weight of active investigation or advocacy, or the constant effort to keep moving forward. She thought about her sister, not as the victim of an unsolved case, but as the woman she had been, flawed and funny and kind, and sometimes exasperating in the way that siblings can be. She thought about how Elaine would have responded to all that had transpired, the investigation and revelations and partial justice. Elaine had been practical, unsentimental about most things, someone who dealt with reality as it existed rather than as she wished it to be. Maureen imagined her sister would have appreciated the scholarship fund, would have approved of the advocacy work, while also gently suggesting that Maureen needed to take care of herself. She imagined Elaine would have liked Emma, would have recognized in her niece a blend of family traits and individual spirit that marked a new generation carrying forward, but not being crushed by the weight of the past. As Maureen finally turned to leave the cemetery, she made a conscious decision that felt both momentous and quietly ordinary. She decided that while she would never forget, would never stop honoring her sister's memory, she would also allow herself to stop waiting. She had spent 20 years in various states of suspended animation, holding space for answers that might never fully arrive, for justice that existed only partially, for a resolution that remained perpetually incomplete. It was time, she realized, to stop waiting and to simply live, to allow the complicated truth of Elaine's story to exist without requiring it to reach a satisfying conclusion. In the months and years that followed, Maureen's life gradually assumed a shape that incorporated, rather than centered around her sister's absence. She continued the scholarship fund, but delegated much of its administration to others. She maintained relationships with other families of missing persons, but established clearer boundaries around her involvement. She invested more time in her marriage, which had weathered the strain of her long obsession with finding answers, but had also been neglected in ways she was only beginning to recognize. She watched her daughter grow toward adulthood with full attention, rather than the divided focus that had characterized too many years. Sarah Chen remained in contact with Maureen, their relationship having evolved beyond the professional into something more complex, a bond forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. They met periodically for coffee or lunch, conversations that touched on the case but also ranged more widely, encompassing their separate lives, the challenges of their respective work, the ways that difficult experiences shaped but did not have to define them. Sarah had learned from Maureen something about resilience, about the difference between giving up and letting go, about how justice sometimes looked different from what any legal system could provide. The true crime documentaries and podcasts that periodically revisited Elaine's case in subsequent years told versions of the story that were simultaneously accurate and incomplete, as all such retellings inevitably are. They focused on the mystery and investigation, the dramatic elements that made for compelling narrative, but they could not fully capture the texture of sustained grief, the daily weight of absence, the small moments of persistence that characterized Maureen's decades of seeking answers. Some of these productions were respectful and well-researched, others more exploitative, and Maureen learned to accept that she could not control how her sister's story was told by others, only how she chose to tell it herself. Emma went on to study journalism in college, drawn by an interest in investigative reporting that clearly had roots in her family history, but was also distinctly her own. She approached her studies with a seriousness of purpose that her professors noted and encouraged, seeing in her work an unusual combination of analytical rigor and deep empathy. When she told her mother about wanting to pursue stories about unsolved cases and systemic failures in criminal justice, Maureen felt a complicated mixture of pride and concern, wanting to support her daughter's calling while also wishing she could protect her from the particular pain that came from immersing oneself in human tragedy. Vincent Holloway lived out his remaining years in obscurity, dying of heart failure at the age of 63 in the small apartment where he had isolated himself from meaningful human connection. The news of his death reached Sarah through routine monitoring of individuals connected to open cases, and she informed Maureen, who received the information with neither satisfaction nor distress, only the acknowledgement that another chapter had closed, that whatever complete truth Vincent might have possessed had died with him. They would never know if his final confession had represented genuine unburdening, or simply another strategic revelation designed to ease his conscience while still protecting himself or others from fuller accountability. The scholarship, established in Elaine's name, continued to grow, funded by Maureen's initial investment and contributions from others who learned of it through various channels. Each year, several young women received support for their education, pursuing careers in fields ranging from engineering to medicine to social work. They learned about the woman whose name appeared on their award letters, about the circumstances that had led to the scholarship's creation, and they carried forward into their own lives an awareness that opportunity could arise from tragedy, that memory could be honored through investment in futures that the dead had been denied. On a spring morning, nearly 25 years after Elaine's disappearance, Maureen received an unexpected letter from a woman named Catherine Brennan, Carl's daughter. Catherine explained that while sorting through her father's remaining possessions in preparation for selling his house, she had discovered a sealed envelope marked with instructions that it should be delivered to Maureen in the event of Carl's death. The envelope had somehow been overlooked in the immediate aftermath of Carl's passing, only now coming to light during a more thorough clearing of his home office. Maureen opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly, unsure what message Carl might have left for her across the years. His handwriting was careful and clear, the script of someone taking time to choose words precisely. He wrote about his decades of thinking about Elaine's case, about the professional frustration of questions that remained unanswered, but also about something deeper, about what the case had taught him about the nature of his work and his responsibility to victims and their families. He wrote that he had learned from watching Maureen's perseverance that justice was not only what happened in courtrooms, but also what happened in the daily choice to remember, to honor, to insist that individual lives mattered against all the forces that suggested otherwise. Carl wrote that he hoped by the time Maureen received this letter, she had found some measure of peace, that the burden of seeking answers had not prevented her from living fully in the present. He expressed admiration for her strength and her refusal to let her sister be forgotten, but he also gently encouraged her to allow herself release from the constant vigil, to trust that Elaine's significance did not depend on Maureen's ongoing sacrifice. He ended the letter with a simple statement that carried unexpected emotional weight. Your sister would be proud of you, not for what you accomplished in investigating her death, but for who you became in the face of devastating loss. Maureen read the letter multiple times, alone in her home office, tears streaming down her face, grieving anew for Carl, who had carried his own burden of unsolved cases and unfulfilled responsibilities, for her sister, whose life had been cut short before she could fully realize her potential, for all the families she had met over the years whose loved ones remained missing or whose cases remained unsolved, for the younger version of herself who had believed that determination alone could force the world to yield its secrets. But she also felt something else, something that had been building gradually over years, but crystallized in this moment. She felt release, the permission to stop carrying single-handedly the weight of ensuring her sister was remembered, to trust that memory could be shared and sustained through structures she had built, and through the lives that continued forward. Emma, home from graduate school for the weekend, found her mother sitting with Carl's letter in her lap, looking out the window at the garden she had cultivated over the years. They sat together in companionable silence, mother and daughter, two women shaped by absence but not defined by it, connected by love and loss but also by resilience and hope. Emma took her mother's hand, and in that simple gesture was acknowledgement of everything that had been survived, everything that continued, everything that mattered, beyond the unanswered questions and partial justice. The sun moved across the sky, marking time as it always had and always would, indifferent to human suffering, but also providing the light by which people could see each other, could bear witness to each other's pain, could choose day after day to continue forward despite uncertainty and incomplete endings. Maureen understood finally that this was what healing looked like, not the dramatic resolution she had once imagined, but rather the gradual accumulation of days lived fully, of love given and received, of meaning constructed from the materials at hand, even when those materials were marked by loss. Elaine Merrick remained present in the world through the scholarship that bore her name, through the advocacy work her sister had pioneered, through the lessons her case had taught investigators about persistence and thoroughness, through the stories that family members told to keep her memory alive. She remained present in the ways that all those who die too soon remain present, incompletely, imperfectly, but genuinely, insisting through their absence that individual lives matter, that the search for truth has value even when truth remains elusive, that love persists beyond death and loss, and all the forces that would prefer forgetting. The story of what happened on that October evening so many years ago would never be fully known, but what had been learned was this. A young woman had tried to build a future for herself through responsible planning and careful decision-making. She had been betrayed by people who valued their own interests above human life. She had died far too young, her potential unrealized, her absence creating a wound in the lives of those who loved her. But she had also been remembered with a fierceness that refused surrender, had been honored through actions that created meaning from tragedy, had mattered enough that people dedicated years to seeking truth on her behalf. In a world that so often treated individual lives as disposable, this insistence on significance, this refusal to forget, this sustained commitment to bearing witness represented its own form of justice, imperfect but genuine, incomplete but essential. And so the story ended not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet acceptance, not with complete answers, but with the understanding that some questions would remain forever open, not with the satisfaction of perfect justice, but with the knowledge that the attempt to seek justice had itself created meaning. The dead could not be brought back. The past could not be changed. But the present could be lived with intention, with memory, with the determination that loss would not be the final word, that love would persist, that even in the face of tragedy and uncertainty, human beings could choose to honor one another, to remember one another, to insist that every life carried weight and significance beyond measure. Maureen stood from her chair, Emma's hand still in hers, and together they walked outside into the afternoon light, carrying forward into whatever future awaited them the complicated legacy of all that had been lost and all that endured, all that remained unanswered and all that had been learned, moving forward not in denial of pain, but in acknowledgement of it, choosing life even while honoring death, embodying the truth that survival itself, conscious and intentional and marked by love, constituted its own form of victory against all the darkness that sought to diminish and destroy.